didn't mention the maple syrup ritual that we go through whenever we meet a fellow Canadian. Recently, I saw a New Yorker cartoon picturing a little girl standing by her parents' bedside in the middle of the night. Dad's fast asleep, but Mom is bleary-eyed, and the little girl says to her, "I had a nightmare that you and Dad woke up one morning on the wrong side of history." The wrong side of history. We've all heard this curious expression before, haven't we? TV commentators assure us that history will decide. History will pass judgment on every political career, every policy decision. History's this authority, and she's not only watching our moves, she's itching to teach us her lessons. If only we could listen. But of course we don't. We're ignorant and stubborn. And so, as the famous saying goes, we are doomed to repeat the past. When the Russians invade Crimea, or the Iranian nuclear program hits the news again, some expert will insist that history teaches us what to do. But can history teach us lessons? I don't think so, and I'd like to try to convince you why that's the case. In fact, I believe that it's downright dangerous for our health to expect lessons from history. Now, to judge from history's very own channel on television, the Nazis and Hitler provide the greatest fund of lessons for all time. And we see this in our political discourse. Almost every week, someone somewhere is being accused of appeasement. Now, this word, as you will know, attaches to one person in the past, Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, who with his French counterpart Daladier signed the Munich Agreement with Hitler and Mussolini in September 1938. Chamberlain thought we had achieved peace for our time, and he arrived at the airport waving this piece of paper. Well, it didn't work out so well, and a year later, a devastating war began. Although it was Chamberlain who declared war, he has gone down in tradition as the embodiment of appeasement, right? The biggest lesson of history ever is you must never appease, i.e., talk with, negotiate with, recalcitrant states. Check the internet, and you will see recent politicians, from Barack Obama and David Cameron to even Teresa May, photoshopped into Chamberlain's 1930s suit, holding the piece of paper. Why? Because in their dealings with Russia, Iran, Korea, or even in the case of May with the European Union, she didn't stand up. She didn't bare her teeth. She tried to talk, to negotiate. But the lesson of history, the biggest lesson ever, is that you must never appease. Even the word sounds creepy, doesn't it? Nobody wants to be an appeaser. Who would want that? Have you ever felt maybe intimidated by these people who tell us about the lessons of history so confidently? History teaches us this. You know, most of us, we don't remember our school history that well, so we kind of think, I don't know, maybe they're right. Could be, I don't know. I've forgotten. So let's do a little experiment. Supposing that instead of feeling guilty about what you don't know, you got up one morning and you said to yourself, by golly, I am going to learn history's lessons. Where do I go for that? Sign me up. Well, you will find out from the people who talk about history's lessons, they can't tell you because those lessons don't exist. There's no database where we can look up immigration, refugees, missile testing, and discover history's lessons. Now, those people might condescendingly brush you off and say, well, go and read the history books. But that's a scam. If you've ever read a history book, you know it doesn't teach lessons. This is not to say that historians never tried. You know, back in the 19th and up to the mid-20th century, they were really worried. Historians were really worried that if they could not produce lessons, if their research could not generate laws of some kind, they would look like a weak discipline, unscientific. What good would they be? So they tried. The problem was people could see right through these lessons because they fit conspicuously well with what the people already believed. So Marxists and capitalists, Christians and atheists, advocates of racial purity and eugenics all said, well, hey, history obviously proves our case. So that was completely discredited. The best example, probably, the last one I know of, is 1968, a book called The Lessons of History by Will and Ariel Durant. And they'd written this beautiful 11-volume story of civilization. Some of you will know it. Detailed history, but they seemed to feel they needed a 100-page statement of the lessons of all this. Well, what did they end up with? They ended up saying history is a department of biology, and the fundamental lessons of history are those of biology: competition, survival of the fittest, natural selection. Okay, but this didn't come from their 11 volumes. So historians gave up on this kind of thing. Now I have a proposal for you. My proposal is the reason that we expect history to teach lessons is because of a confusion between history and something else, which is tradition. What do I mean by that? Well, tradition is the past on wheels, right? The past roaring toward us, imposing itself on us and asking us to believe its lessons. Every group we belong to, from our family to a professional, military, religious organization we join, and above all the state, has its traditions, of course. The tradition is what the established members of the group want newer members to know. And so they take elements of the past, they fashion them together into a story, and they present them to us on a platter and say, this is the meaning of the past. This is not bad. It's part of life, belonging to a group, but it's not history. I would say the problem begins in school, because what we study in school as history is, in fact, tradition. It's what the elders want the young to know about the past, right? So all across the world, from Japan to Korea, from Israel, Palestine, through Germany, France, to the Texas School Board, these debates go on constantly about what should we be teaching the young. But when you talk about what shall we pass along, that's tradition. Well, what's history then? History is the opposite. What is the past? Let's think about that for a moment. The past, of course, is innocent of any lessons. The past is just all the stuff that happened, right? Much of it horrible, some of it pleasant, most of it forgettable. But anyway, it's all gone. So that's the past. I've said that tradition is the past hurtling toward us, lobbing its lessons at us and saying, learn this. History, I would say, is simply the opposite. History originates in us. It begins when we have a question about the past. And when our questions are powerful enough to animate us, to get the skills to go and investigate for ourselves, then we are doing history. We are committing history. That's history. History is our investigation of the past. But because it originates with us, it is in us, it isn't something that can teach us lessons, right? It's something we do. Okay, but am I not exaggerating to say that it's dangerous to think that history teaches lessons? Well, no, I don't think so. First of all, if we think that history is supposed to teach lessons, and we are ashamed not to know them, we make ourselves vulnerable to those who claim to know them. Right? That's the first thing. Second, it can be physically dangerous. In the First World War, the nations of Europe went into the conflict thinking they had learned the lessons of history. From Napoleon and Clausewitz, they had learned that when you have an enemy, you must bring all your resources to bear against that enemy's center of gravity to deliver the knockout blow. But they'd all learned the same lessons. So the problem was, very soon, they're in opposed trenches, and all they can do is pile in more soldiers and more weapons until 18 million people are dead, and there are no winners. A much better guide to action than the supposed lessons of history is a motto from a recent American commander-in-chief who liked to say, "Don't do stupid shit." So if history doesn't teach lessons, what good is it? Why does it matter? Well, my answer to that question is it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to everyone. Nothing matters to everyone. It only matters if you care about the human past. But you can live a happy and prosperous life without history or theoretical physics or any number of other things. But history has its attractions. First of all, it liberates us, primarily from tradition. It allows us to think for ourselves and to go and investigate and find out what we think. Second, democracy needs people who can think for themselves. Not necessarily who know a bunch of facts, but who know what evidence is and where to find it, where to seek it, how to interpret it, how to criticize the use of others, the use of that evidence by others for dodgy so-called lessons of history. And third, it can bring us huge enrichment in our lives. In our cafe and computer cages in the 21st century, we can imagine only a fraction of life's possibilities, right? One way to imagine them is to experience other cultures today, of course. Another way is to cast our minds back to places that are very different from our world, to think about different value systems, different frameworks of meaning, different ways of looking at the world. My friends, history is obviously the most fun you can have with your mind. But because it rejects all authority over the mind, the one thing it cannot do is teach lessons. Thank you.